The land was dry, so dry it cracked like porcelain beneath your boots. The kind of place where the sun didn't just shine, it burned. Where the wind didn't carry hope, but dust, sorrow, and silence. This was Dry Hollow, a town with more graves than promises, more rumors than kindness. And on the edge of it, past the mesquite trees and the judgmental stairs, lived a woman named Hannah Moore. She was young, but not in the way that drew admiration anymore. Her youth made people uncomfortable. A widow who didn't wear black long enough, who didn't remarry fast enough, who didn't break fast enough. Her husband, James, had died the previous winter from a fever so sudden no doctor could explain it, and no preacher could pray it away. The town buried him. Then they buried her with gossip. Alone on a ranch left barely standing, Hannah did what too many don't. She stayed. With no family, no water in the well, no money in the drawer, just will. Just stubborn, bone-deep grit that wouldn't bend even when the world whispered, "You should." She fought fences that wouldn't hold. She prayed over a well that gave less every morning. She wore a straw hat to shade her from the sun that didn't care, and boots worn thin from walking land too dry to forgive. And that might have been all she ever had, just her and the land, and the slow, silent collapse of everything she once believed in. Until one morning, barely past dawn, she saw something behind the barn. At first, it looked like a bundle of old blankets. Maybe travelers had left something behind, or maybe she was just imagining things. But when she walked closer, breath catching in the stillness, she realized it was a man. Not just any man. He was native. Apache by the looks of his necklace, the single feather tangled in his dark, dust-matted hair. He wasn't wearing boots. His deer-hide shirt was torn, exposing a wound on his shoulder so deep it showed bone. Blood had soaked into the earth around him, dark and rust-colored. The earth didn't drink it, it held it. Like a warning. Like a memory. She froze. Every story she had ever been told as a child, of raids, of fire, of missing children, came rushing back. Warnings whispered in pews, threats murmured in saloons. And yet, he didn't move toward her, didn't speak, just groaned, weakly, trying to lift his head, failing. He was dying, and not quickly. Hannah looked around. No one was coming. The road behind her was empty. The town wouldn't help. They wouldn't even care. To them, a dying Apache on the edge of a white woman's ranch wasn't a tragedy. It was an inconvenience. And maybe she should have walked away. Maybe it would have been easier. But instead, she went to the barn. Moments later, she came back with a tin cup, dented and nearly empty, filled with the last of her well water, the last of anything that still gave life on her land. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what he'd done. She just lifted his head and placed the cup to his lips. At first, he didn't drink. His eyes opened, dark, unreadable, wild. They locked onto hers. Then, slowly, his lips parted. He drank. Just a sip. But sometimes a sip is everything. When he finished, she set the cup down. Her hands shook. Her heart thudded in her chest like something trying to escape. He didn't thank her, didn't curse her. He just looked at her. Then closed his eyes, exhaling, almost in peace. And she walked back to her house, unsure if she'd just saved a life or invited death into her home. In her mind, the doubt whispered loud. Maybe I should have done what they expect. Stay quiet, stay small, stay safe. But she wasn't built for obedience. Not anymore. She'd already lost a husband, a future, a place in this town's favor. She wouldn't lose herself, too. But what came next would change everything. But here's the thing. Sometimes the most important choices we make aren't loud. They're quiet. A hand extended. A risk taken. A sip of water offered when it would have been easier to walk away. In Dry Hollow, kindness was dangerous, but Hannah gave it anyway, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same after that.
Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness feels like the biggest gamble, and in Dry Hollow, where fear grew faster than crops and kindness often came with a cost, Hannah Moore took that gamble. She knelt beside a dying man, a stranger, an Apache, and offered him the last of her water. That cup wasn't just tin and rust, it was everything she had left. Her well was nearly dry, her hope even more so, but something inside her refused to let him die alone in the dirt. He didn't speak, he didn't lash out, he didn't even look grateful. He just drank, slowly, silently, as if that sip were the first thing he trusted in days, maybe weeks. And that trust, it changed something. You see, where she lived, stories about men like him were whispered behind church doors and over whiskey glasses, stories that made people clutch their children closer and load rifles without questions. He was meant to be feared, avoided, forgotten. But lying there, bleeding into her land, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like a man. Hannah didn't ask who he was or what brought him there. She didn't ask what tribe he came from, what battles he'd fought, or what sins the town would accuse him of. All she knew was this: he was wounded, and she had water. It was the first time she had given something without knowing if she'd get to wake up the next morning. And that night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her wooden chair by the window, staring out at the barn, half expecting the shadows to move, half waiting for a knock at the door, or worse, the sheriff. Every creak in the floorboards, every howl of wind through broken shutters made her heart skip. What had she done? Had she saved a life or put herself in danger? But here's the thing. The moment you help someone no one else would, you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. It's not just an act, it's a choice. And choices, especially the quiet ones, echo in ways we never expect. That night, Hannah felt the weight of that echo. Because it's one thing to give help. It's another to wonder what help demands in return. Out there in the barn, the man she had saved didn't speak a word. He didn't knock. He didn't come to her door. He simply lay still, breathing slowly, as if that sip of water was enough for now. As if he knew this was more than charity. It was trust offered carefully across an invisible line drawn by generations of pain. And yet, trust is where every story worth telling begins. In the dark, Hannah found herself whispering things she hadn't said out loud in months, not even to herself. Memories of James, the bitterness left behind by his silence before death, the weight of being seen as too strong, too different, too alone. And somehow, without a single word spoken between them, she knew the man outside the window carried his own stories. Stories burned into his skin, into his silence, into the fact that he hadn't begged or explained or run. In that silence, something grew. Not safety, not comfort, at least not yet, but a seed, a bond, a beginning. Because when you offer someone dying a drink of water, you're not just saving their body, you're acknowledging their humanity. You're saying, I see you. I don't have much, but I have this, and I'm giving it to you. And maybe, just maybe, they offer something back. Something not asked for, not promised, something deeper than thanks. The night passed slowly. The stars above the canyon flickered like memories that refused to fade. The land remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Something had changed. And by dawn, the sun had yet to rise, but the world already felt different. Hannah had taken a risk, and it had begun something she couldn't yet name, but would never forget.
At sunrise, the land held its breath. The wind had changed direction, cooler now, but charged, like the stillness before a storm. Hannah stood on her porch, the same place where she had offered water to a dying man just hours earlier, and felt something shift deep in the bones of the earth. Then she heard it, not thunder from the sky, but from the ground. A low rumble, steady and growing, the kind of sound that lives in your chest before it reaches your ears. Horses, dozens of them, coming fast. No shouting, no dust cloud, just the relentless beat of hooves like a war drum getting louder. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her hand gripped the rifle James had left behind, not loaded, not useful, but somehow comforting in its weight. The kind of comfort we reach for when all logic tells us to run. And then they appeared, silhouetted against the orange morning sky, rising from the horizon like ghosts in formation, Apache warriors, sharp-eyed, silent, faces painted with dignity and warning. Their presence was not loud, but it was absolute. She was surrounded. And then she saw him, the same man she had given water to, now upright, still pale, blood staining the sleeve of his shirt, but alive and riding at the front. He stepped forward, slowly, limping, but with purpose. His eyes never left hers. He stepped forward, not as a threat, but as someone carrying the weight of a promise. The other warriors waited, still as stone. Then he spoke, just one word, to her, and then more to them, words in Apache, low and firm, impossible for her to understand, but heavy with meaning. Whatever he said, it changed everything. One by one, the warriors began to lower their weapons, not surrendering, just choosing not to strike. A few gave him a quiet nod. Then, without another sound, they began to turn away. Some looked back, most didn't, but none made a move toward her, not a word, not a gesture of violence. Except for him. He didn't leave. Instead, he walked past her, toward the barn, and sat down in the shade near the water trough. He didn't speak again, didn't ask for more water, didn't ask for food or shelter. He just leaned against a post like he belonged there, like he always had. And Hannah, she stood frozen, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't understand what had just happened. This man, this stranger, had come within inches of death, had been carried home in silence by warriors feared across the region, and yet he stayed. And not as a prisoner, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Repayment, maybe, or honor, or something older than either. She had given him a cup of water, and in return, he gave her something more valuable than gold out there in the desert: protection. That morning, while the rest of Dry Hollow awoke to another day of heat and suspicion, Hannah watched as the man began to work. No questions, no commands, just action. He repaired the fence post she had failed to fix the day before, chopped wood with a shoulder still bleeding through its bandage, pulled water from the well with hands steady and practiced. Every time she tried to stop him, worried he was pushing himself too far, he would say the same thing, quietly, simply. You gave, I return. It wasn't a transaction, it was a truth. There's a kind of dignity that doesn't need to be spoken, a kind of strength that doesn't ask for praise. This man, who hadn't yet shared his name, moved with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what it meant to be forgotten and yet refused to vanish. And Hannah, for the first time in months, felt not alone. This wasn't the kind of alliance written into law. It wasn't recognized by the town or protected by any sheriff. It was born of dirt and dust, of wounds and water, of silence and survival. Some might have called it madness, others betrayal. But Hannah understood something most never would. When you offer kindness into a world that's forgotten how to receive it, sometimes it returns in forms you never expected. In the form of a warrior who rides at dawn, in the echo of hooves across scorched land, in the steady hands that fix a fence without being asked. This wasn't the end of trouble, not by a long shot, but it was the beginning of something far rarer. A bond. A kind of peace, forged, not in treaty, but in choice.
Trust is a strange thing. It doesn't show up with fanfare. It doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself. Sometimes it starts with a cup of water and grows in silence. After the Apache warrior chose to stay, after he began working the land like it was his own, something began to shift on Hannah Moore's ranch. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like the way light creeps in before dawn, changing the room before you even realize the sun is up. He never asked to stay. He never made demands. He didn't even speak much. But every morning he was there, before the sun, before the wind had woken up, feeding the fire, brushing the horses, checking the fence, and always with that same calm presence, that same quiet focus, like every motion was part of something sacred. And Hannah, she noticed. At first, she watched him with guarded curiosity. She still didn't know his name, still didn't know why he'd been bleeding behind her barn. But she knew one thing. She didn't feel afraid anymore, not with him there. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, a quiet strength that made the world feel less fragile. She hadn't felt that in a long time, not since James was alive, and maybe not even then. One morning, while bringing out water, she finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "They'll come looking." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, steady, unreadable. Then, with a voice rough like wind through dry grass, he said, "You saved. I protect." 4 words. That's all. But they hit deeper than any speech could. He wasn't there for shelter. He wasn't there out of weakness or need. He was there because she had given what could not be repaid. And in return, he had made her safety his duty. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It wasn't a bond built on desire or even affection. It was something older, more primal, a trait of honor, a recognition that when someone saves your life with nothing in return, the only thing you can offer back is everything. He never crossed her doorway, never stepped into her home. He always stayed just far enough to respect the space between them, but never so far she forgot he was there. That distance, it mattered. It said, "I will protect you, but I will not claim you." Some people would call that strange. But sometimes the most powerful relationships begin not with closeness, but with boundaries, with silence, with respect. Over time, small things began to speak louder than words. She'd find her tools sharpened, her boots cleaned. The barn door, once crooked, hung straight on its hinges. A rabbit, skinned and cleaned, left quietly by her porch. Never mentioned, never claimed, just done. And something in her, something long ignored, began to breathe again. It's easy to forget what it feels like to be seen without judgment, to be helped without being pitied, to be guarded without being controlled. That was what this man offered, not in words, but in presence. In a world that had told Hannah she was too much, too alone, too complicated, he simply stayed. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that, more than any promise, built something real between them. Not love, not yet, but trust. And in a place like Dry Hollow, that was rarer than rain.
Small towns remember everything, especially the things they never saw for themselves. And Dry Hollow, it didn't take long for the whispers to begin. Hannah Moore, the widow who lived too far out and stayed too long alone, had done something unforgivable in the eyes of her neighbors. She had offered kindness to a man they called the enemy. They didn't care that he was wounded. They didn't ask what had happened. To them, she wasn't just helping a stranger. She was harboring a threat. The word traitor came easy to their lips, spoken not in open anger, but in corners, behind curtains, through narrowed eyes and clenched jaws. One morning, when Hannah walked into the general store, silence fell like a stone dropped in water. 3 ranchers by the counter turned to stare. One muttered something crude. Another just spat on the floor. But it was the sheriff, Maddox, who stepped out from behind the shelves, pushing his glasses up, eyes heavy with something between concern and cowardice. "Miss Moore," he said, "we've had reports." She didn't flinch. "Reports," she echoed, "or gossip." He sighed. "You know tensions are high. People are nervous. They say you're keeping one of them out there, that you're feeding him, sleeping." She raised a hand before he could finish. "I gave a man water. That's what I did." A rancher nearby laughed. "That what they're calling it now?" Maddox held up a hand to quiet them, but the damage was done. "You need to be careful, Hannah. The town's not going to protect you if this gets worse. You've got to decide, are you with us or with him?" And there it was, the line drawn in the dust. It wasn't about laws. It wasn't about safety. It was about allegiance, about fear wrapped in tradition, about who gets to belong and who never did. She met the sheriff's eyes, steady, calm, unapologetic. "I never chose a side, but I know what I won't choose, fear." And she walked out, sack of flour in her hand, spine straight, despite the weight pressing down from every direction. That night, she sat on her porch, arms crossed, staring into the dusk, as the Apache warrior sat a few feet away, sharpening a blade by firelight. She told him what the town was saying, that they thought she was a traitor, that they thought she was sleeping with him. He didn't react, didn't laugh, didn't get angry, just kept sharpening, like he had already heard worst. "Are you not going to say anything?" she asked. He paused. "Words are smoke," he said. She almost laughed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll run out of town." He looked up then, calm, steady. "You gave water to a dying man. That is not shame. That is root." Root. She didn't understand the word at first, but he explained. "In my people, a woman who gives water gives life, not just to body, but to spirit. You gave what cannot be repaid." And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because what he said wasn't a compliment. It was truth. A truth that felt heavier than judgment, but also freer. That night, she couldn't sleep, because the town's judgment wasn't just noise anymore. It was a threat, a promise wrapped in silence, and she could feel it growing in the bones of the house, in the quiet between stars, in the way the shutters creaked, even when there was no wind. But Hannah knew something now that she hadn't known before. People don't need reasons to hate, only excuses. And the only thing that ever changes that kind of thinking is courage. The quiet kind. The kind that stands tall on a porch with the whole town watching and says, "I don't owe you my fear." So, she didn't choose a side. She chose herself. And for the first time, that was enough.
There's something about nightfall in the desert. It doesn't just bring darkness. It brings a silence so deep, it feels like the land is holding its breath. But that night, Hannah Moore felt something different. a pressure, like the calm wasn't calm at all, just a pause before something violent. And she was right. It happened just past midnight. The first sound was wood cracking, then boots on dry boards. A chicken scream, sharp, sudden, cut through the silence. She shot up from her bed, heart pounding like hooves on hard ground, ran to the window, and there they were. 5 men, lanterns, guns, rope. They had come not as lawmen, not even as thieves, but as something worse, men who believed they could act without consequence. She saw the branding iron, glowing hot in one man's hand. She saw the rope already knotted. And then she saw the face leading them. Brody, the same man who once offered to help her after James died, always with strings attached. The man who had circled her land like a vulture for months, waiting for her to break. And now he wasn't waiting anymore. "I warned you, Hannah. Keep feeding savages and you'll lose more than chickens." She grabbed the rifle, still unloaded, but held it anyway. The kind of gesture that wasn't meant to win, just to say, "I see you." The barn doors burst open. But what came out wasn't panic. It was Takakota. Not running, not shouting, just walking. Calm, deliberate, like a storm already in motion. Brody raised his gun. He shouldn't have. Takakota moved like wind cutting through wheat, a blur of bone and blade. The branding iron flew from one man's hand, clattering into the dirt. One attacker tried to run. Another swung a weapon. He didn't get far. In under a minute, the yard was silent again, except for the groans of the wounded. 4 men on the ground. One had run, but none were dead. And Takakota? He stood near the fence, chest heaving, knife wet in his hand. Then he turned to Hannah. His voice was low, final. "I stay, until all danger sleeps." She didn't answer with words. She just nodded, shaken, heart thudding in her throat, because she understood something deeper than language. This wasn't just repayment anymore. This was promise. By dawn, the blood had dried and the men were gone. She never asked where he took them, never asked how. What mattered wasn't what happened to them, but what didn't happen to her, because for the first time since James died, Hannah Moore didn't feel defenseless. And Takakota hadn't stayed because he owed her. He stayed because, somewhere in that firelit night, the line between protector and guest had disappeared. What stood in its place wasn't something written down or spoken aloud. It was something earned, something real. Most people believe protection comes with a badge, or a law, or a fence. But sometimes protection comes in the form of a man who moves without hesitation, who steps between you and violence with nothing but his hands and his word. And when that man says, "I stay until all danger sleeps," you believe him, because he's already proven it.
Word travels fast in a town like Dry Hollow, faster than a bullet, faster than truth. By midday, the whispers were wildfire. People didn't talk to Hannah, but they talked about her, loud enough for her to hear. That she was hiding a savage, that she'd turned her back on her kind, that she brought danger onto good Christian land. But what they didn't talk about was the night 4 men came to kill her, and how they left broken and bleeding. No one asked how she survived. They only asked why she hadn't been killed. And that said everything. Sheriff Maddox rode out by late afternoon, 2 deputies trailing him. He stopped just shy of her fence line, didn't dare step farther. His boots stayed clean. His conscience didn't. Hannah met him on the porch, rifle leaning against the wall like a warning she no longer had to fake. "We heard there was trouble," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "I'm still here," she replied. His gaze flicked to the barn. "Was it him?" he asked. "Were they after him?" She didn't answer. "Hannah, I can't protect you if you don't help me help you." Her voice stayed flat. "I never asked you to protect me." The tension cracked like dry wood. One deputy muttered, "She's hiding a savage, that's what this is. Those men came to protect the town." Hannah took one step forward, calm, precise. "They broke into my home in the middle of the night," she said, "lit my barn on fire, brought rope and iron. You call that protection?" Maddox raised a hand to calm things, but it was already too late. The other deputy's hand went to his holster, gaze hard. And then, movement. Takakota stepped from behind the barn. No weapon, no threat, just presence. But that alone was enough. The deputies stiffened. The tension in their shoulders told the story. Fear doesn't always need a reason. Sometimes it just needs a face. "Stand down," Maddox barked, voice cracking the still air. Takakota raised both hands slowly, then stepped back into the shadows. The sheriff turned to Hannah, eyes tired. "You've got to choose, the town or him. You can't have both." She didn't flinch. "I never asked for either." That night she sat by the fire, arms crossed, the memory of those words heavy on her chest. "You shouldn't have come out," she told him quietly. "You gave them more reasons." "They do not need reasons," he said, "only excuses." And she knew he was right. The town had never accepted her, not when she was married, not when she was grieving, and certainly not now that she was choosing to think for herself. She looked into the fire. "I used to believe this land was home. Now, I'm not sure it ever was." Takakota didn't speak right away. Then softly, "Home is not a place, it is a choice." She turned to him. "And what if I chose wrong?" His answer came slow but sure. "Then we fight for it." That next morning, still carrying his words, she climbed into the loft of the old barn, a place she hadn't touched since before James died. She needed flour, a tool, she wasn't sure. What she found instead was something else entirely. A letter, tucked in a cracked envelope, brittle with dust and time, addressed to Brody, signed almost by James. It wasn't just ink, it was betrayal. In that letter, her late husband had agreed to sell the ranch 3 weeks before he died, without telling her, without even preparing her. Just take the money and let Brody handle the rest. The man who now wanted her land by force nearly bought it with her husband's silence. She brought the letter straight to the courthouse, marched in wearing the same black dress from the funeral, pressed, pinned, proud. Let them see her, let them stare. Inside, she laid the paper on Judge Leland's desk. This was never signed. James planned to sell, but he didn't. And now Brody's trying to take what's not his, through threats and fire. The judge read the letter. His brow creased. Then he looked up. "Let me look into it." Back at the ranch, she handed the letter to Takakota. "It's not over, but I'm not running." He nodded. And for the first time since it all began, she took a step forward, not to defend, not to retreat, but to claim what was hers. Because land is more than dirt, and trust is more than words. And sometimes, the only way to silence a town's judgment is to outlive it.
Some bonds don't begin with a conversation. They begin with silence, with presence, with a pair of hands that show up day after day, even when no one asks them to. That's how it happened with Hannah and Takakota. After the fire, after the threats, after the sheriff's visit and the unsigned letter that nearly sold her life out from under her, things didn't return to normal. They didn't need to. Something better was taking its place. Takakota never claimed space. He simply made himself useful. He repaired the barn roof. He set traps that caught rabbits but didn't harm them. He chopped wood even when his hands were still wrapped in cloth from the last fight. He never waited to be told, he never asked for thanks, and he never once tried to step into the house uninvited. Instead, he stayed close, just close enough to be felt, never close enough to be questioned. And that quiet respect, it meant more to Hannah than any apology or gesture ever could. She started noticing the small things first. The broken drawer in the barn, suddenly fixed. Her boots, once caked in mud, clean and polished by morning.
A bundle of herbs hung carefully from the porch rail, tied with a thin strip of rawhide. He didn't speak much, but every action told a story. And slowly, something inside Hannah softened. She stopped waiting for the knock at the door, for the sheriff's second warning, for Brody's return, because each day that passed without fear was its own kind of healing. And Takakota, he became a part of that healing, not by force, not by promise, but by presence. They didn't talk much over meals. He always waited for her to take the first bite. He never sat too close, never stared too long. But when she looked up, his gaze was already waiting, steady, respectful, without expectation. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills and painted the land in amber light, they sat in the quiet together. The breeze was soft, like it had finally stopped holding its breath. She turned to him and said, "I used to think this place was only mine because James left it to me." He didn't answer. She added, "But lately it feels like it belongs to both of us, not by law, but by rhythm." He looked at her then and said something she would carry with her the rest of her life. Home is not a place, it is a choice. Those words struck deeper than any sermon, because Hannah knew what it felt like to live in a house and still feel like a stranger, to sleep under a roof built with someone else's rules, to inherit land that didn't yet feel like it wanted you. But now for the first time, the land seemed to breathe easier. Not because the storms had stopped, but because she had someone beside her who didn't just survive with her, but endured with her. Someone who had chosen this place not for comfort, not for safety, but for her. The feelings between them weren't loud. They weren't dressed up in poetry. They lived in the silence between chores, in the way he handed her tools without needing to be asked, in the space he gave her, without distance, in the way she began to leave out a second cup without realizing it. And that was more honest than any love story the town had ever dared to whisper about. Because sometimes connection doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up in a man sharpening a blade quietly by the barn, or in a woman who no longer locks her door at night. And sometimes it starts not with love, but with trust. Not spoken, not promised, but real.
Some endings don't come quietly. They come with boots on dust, guns drawn, and truths dragged into the daylight. By the time Hannah Moore rode into the center of Dry Hollow, the town square was already filling up. Men leaning on porch rails, women whispering from behind lace curtains, children watching like it was Sunday theater. Brody stood at the center, arms crossed, smug as a fox who thought he'd already won. His men flanked him, rough-faced, confident, the kind of confidence that comes from a long history of getting your way. But this time, Hannah wasn't coming in from behind. She dismounted, handed her reins to Takakota, who had come with her, silent as ever, and walked straight to the courthouse steps, black dress catching wind, eyes never leaving the judge. "Judge Leland," she said, loud enough for all to hear, "you said you'd look into the deed." The old man nodded. He held up a folder, thick with papers, yellowed by heat and time. "I did," he said, "and what I found is this. Mr. Brody never filed a purchase contract. There's no legal transfer. The letter your husband left behind only proves intention, not completion." Brody stepped forward, voice rising. "We had a deal." The judge didn't flinch. "You had a promise from a man who's now dead, and that's not the same as ownership." The crowd murmured like dry leaves rustling before a storm. Brody's face twisted. "She's lying. That paper could have been forged. She's shacked up with an Apache. Of course she'd do anything to keep that land." And then every eye turned.
to Takakota. Still as stone, not a threat, not a sound. But something in him made the crowd step back all the same, except Brody. Brody reached for his pistol. It happened fast, too fast for thought, but not too fast for Takakota. One step, two. Then his arm was a blur. He struck Brody's wrist just as the gun fired, knocking it sideways. The bullet flew wild. Screams broke out. Brody hit the ground with a thud. And Takakota didn't strike again. He didn't beat him. He didn't shout. He simply pinned Brody with a knee to the chest, one hand at his throat, firm enough to make him feel small, but not enough to kill. Judge Leland shouted, "Let him go!" Takakota looked at Hannah. She nodded. He stepped back. Brody gasped for breath, humiliated before the entire town. Not a soul moved to help him. Not this time. The judge handed Hannah the deed, freshly signed, stamped, and sealed. "It's yours," he said, legally, permanently. She took it with both hands, not shaking, not smiling, just steady. "Thank you," she said. Leland glanced toward Takakota. "You might consider moving farther out, for safety." Hannah turned, looked at the man who had stood between her and death more than once, then looked back at the judge. "We'll consider a lot of things," she said. That night, back on the ranch, there were no speeches, no celebrations, just 2 cups of coffee beneath a sky full of stars. Hannah leaned her shoulder against his, and he didn't move away. "I thought I would lose everything," she said. Takakota looked at her, voice quiet. "You found something instead." She turned. "What?" He hesitated for only a second, then, "Someone." And that one word, soft, honest, simple, meant more than any oath or promise. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from law. It comes from standing your ground, from telling the truth when everyone wants you to stay silent, from reaching out to someone the world told you to fear, and finding not a threat, but a partner. Hannah didn't just win her land that day. She reclaimed her voice, her future, her place.
Not all love stories begin with a kiss. Some begin with silence, with a cup of water, with a choice made in the middle of nowhere, when no one was watching and everything felt like it might fall apart. That was Hannah and Dakota. They never said the words, not in the way people expect, but somehow they always knew. He stayed, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as something that didn't need a title. And she didn't ask him to leave, not once. They lived in rhythm, moved like 2 parts of the same wind. Each morning, Dakota rose before the sun. He fixed what was broken, tended what needed care. He never asked for more than what was offered. He never crossed lines that hadn't first been opened by her. And Hannah? She started to breathe easier. Not because the world had suddenly become safe, but because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't carrying it alone. Then one evening, as the stars came out and the well shimmered under moonlight, he handed her a small cloth bundle. No words, just a simple gesture, like handing over something sacred. Inside was a necklace, beads of bone and turquoise, a raven feather, and a small carved stone shaped like a wave. She looked up at him, eyes soft, unsure. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What does it mean?" He didn't hesitate. Water is more than survival. It's spirit, memory, the bond between 2 lives. This stone, it means you are not alone.
Her breath caught. And then she did something neither of them had planned. She chose. She chose to wear it, chose to believe in it, chose him. Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because sometimes choosing love means choosing courage. And in that moment, she wasn't afraid anymore. From that day on, something shifted, not just between them, but in the town itself. People who once stared now nodded. A child left flowers on her fence. An old woman brought eggs without asking for coin. The sheriff stopped by not to threaten, but to check in. No apologies, no grand gestures, but kindness, quiet and slow, began to return to Dry Hollow. Not because the town had changed overnight, but because one woman had stood her ground, and one man had walked beside her. They still didn't talk much. They didn't need to. She leaned her head against his shoulder by the fire. He didn't move away. They watched the stars flicker, the grass sway, the well water glint like it remembered everything. "Do you ever miss the life you had before?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then said, "Yes, but this is something new." And maybe that's all love really is. Not forgetting where you came from, but choosing, deliberately, quietly, every day, to begin again. Because kindness carries risk, but it also carries reward. And sometimes the greatest reward of all is someone who stays.